Welcome to AUA Leadership in Business, an official podcast of the American Urological Association.
Welcome to the AUA Leadership in Business podcast, where urologic professionals experience the practical application of business acumen essentials for success in today's dynamic professional landscape. I'm Dr. Steve Riggs, and on today's episode, we will discuss building your network of influence beyond urology, how to network for the short and long wins with Dr. David Miller. Dr. Miller is probably well known to most people in urology. He is currently a professor in the Department of Urology at the University of Michigan, and had garnered quite a bit of attention around his work with MUSIC, which is the Michigan Urologic Surgery Improvement Collaborative, a consortium he led of more than 40 urology practices aiming to improve the quality and cost efficiency of urologic care in the state of Michigan. He received his medical training at Washington University School of Medicine. He completed his residency at the University of Michigan and has research training as in a Master's of Public Health and Epidemiology and completion of Health Services Research Fellowships at University of Michigan and the University of California, Los Angeles. He is currently the Executive Vice Dean of Clinical Affairs for the Medical School and President of University of Michigan Health, overseeing all aspects of strategic, operational, clinical, cultural, and financial performance of the University of Michigan Health Clinical Enterprise, including nearly 2,000 physicians, 140 clinics, and 40 sites within the health system. In middle 2025, he will assume Executive Vice President for Medical Affairs and Chief Executive Officer of Michigan Medicine. And I can truly say Dr. Miller is one of the most humble and thoughtful leaders in the field of healthcare delivery. It is a real privilege for us to have him today, and I think a real privilege to the audience. So welcome, David.
Thank you, Steve. It's great to be here, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to meet with you. This is a great podcast, and I'm hopeful that I can offer some thoughts and perspectives that may be useful. As you know, thank you for the kind introduction, but foundationally, I'm an incredibly proud member of the urology community.
Thank you. So when we first started talking about this, and when I look at your career, which is, the way I look at it, it's had just a meteoric rise in terms of its trajectory and such a dynamic career. And I think when I look at you, I see just this uncanny ability to create human connection. And in part, what we're going to talk about is networking that's really enabled you to build this dynamic career. And I'd like to really start off by you just telling our audience about yourself and about your story and potentially how that relates to your current leadership style and kind of where you got to where you are.
Thanks, Steve. Sure, I'd be happy to share a few thoughts. I mean, you mentioned some of my background and sites of training. I completed my urology training at University of Michigan and then fellowship at UCLA, and was the beneficiary of tremendous support and mentorship early in my career, including from Jim Monty, who was the chair of urology at Michigan at the time, Mark Litwin, who was one of the most significant mentors in my career, and the opportunity to work with great colleagues throughout that time. And I entered a career in urology, really in academic urology, with the goal of trying to advance clinical care and science in urologic oncology. As you mentioned, I was working, my early career started caring for patients with urologic cancer and working in the field of health services research, kind of the idea of how do we improve access, quality outcomes of care for patients with urologic cancer. And a lot of that early on focused on evaluating variation in care delivery. But in the back of my mind, I was always very interested in how to translate describing that variation into improvements of care. And I'll come back to that theme in a few minutes. But very early in my career, I was interested in building an excellent clinical urological practice, advancing research, training residents and fellows, really immersing myself in academic urology. And probably along the way, the pathway to where I've ended up now has been some combination of serendipity and planning. And I'd start by saying, that work with wanting to not just describe variation, but improve or the variation really led to the efforts to establish music. You mentioned the Michigan Urologic Surgery Improvement Collaborative, an area of work where I am very grateful to have the chance to have spent nearly 10 years working in music with Jim Monty, Kershid Ghani, Susan Linsell, many others who've been great leaders, and all the urologists in the state of Michigan. We used to say we want to be the best in the world for prostate cancer care by almost any measure. And I think we achieved that in a lot of areas. But that really represented the opportunity to translate variation in care delivery into improvements. And for instance, why do we see wide differences in the use of active surveillance, and how do we understand what the patient or the physician or the regulatory or the financial factors are that lead to those variations? And that was a very intentional approach, and was actually leading to efforts to write more grants, publish broadly, continue to progress in academic urology. And probably there was some serendipity that then happened, because at that time our health system here in Michigan established some relationships with other health systems across the state. One of them that was near where I grew up in Midland, a couple hours north of Ann Arbor. And I became interested in how do you make that relationship more than just a business relationship, where we talk a lot about the Block M at Michigan, where the Block M was in a community, but how do you make it matter to patients, to the community members, to the physicians? And so it became clear to me that some of the work being done in music, this idea of collaborating to understand and improve care, might be an important connector in that business relationship. And so somewhat serendipitously, I got involved with our health systems work in that area. And that then introduced me to the first time to more of the business and operational aspects of healthcare delivery. But what also became clear to me was that as you try to improve quality to scale, it needs to be connected to the clinical operations. It can't be kind of a separate one-time initiative. Instead, it has to be part of the culture, part of the operations, how you think about everything from staffing to policies to culture in an organization to really improve quality. And so that was one key takeaway from that first serendipitous experience. The other was just some more exposure to the business side of medicine. We were growing at that time as a health system, and I had the opportunity to be involved in conversations related to growth with additional health systems and the business sides of what you might call mergers and acquisition or member substitution in the nonprofit world. And so that was a set of experiences that broadened my lens a little bit, and to the point of networks, broadened my relationships a bit. So if the next step was then planning, that was really to transition into more of an operational role. And I was fortunate enough to be selected and have support to be the chief clinical officer for our adult hospitals. Think of a 600 or 700 bed hospital that is kind of the flagship university hospital. And there I really learned more about multidisciplinary care programs. How do you move outside of your own specialty and really work across multiple specialties? Started to learn more, think about areas of access like length of stay and how do you safely address length of stay. I learned about patient experience and team engagement and how do you work in that area, both as a physician leader and with non-physician or non-clinical leaders. And I also started to learn about finance. You have responsibility for a profit and loss statement. And how do you understand, what are the levers you have to maintain financial performance so you can invest in your programs and your teams and your facilities while still relentlessly focusing as the most important thing on quality, safety, patient experience, team experience. And that was a significant learning opportunity. And so that may have been some planning. And then perhaps serendipity again was the movement into the current role when the predecessor in my role, who was an excellent mentor and colleague, decided to step down. The position as president of our health system opened, and I was encouraged by some members of our community to look at it. I certainly had a lot to learn at every step. I mean, at each one of these steps, Steve, there was a lot to learn. But moving into this one, I asked myself, will I have an opportunity for new mentorship? I think we all need that at different points of our career. Will I have an opportunity to gain new skills and to make a bigger impact? And when you put the opportunity up against that rubric, then you ask yourself, do you feel like you're ready for that challenge? And so this was a bit of a serendipitous opportunity. It's been a biggest learning experience of my career. I've made many mistakes. I've learned a lot. I've gained new relationships. I've recognized my own vulnerabilities and limitations, and hopefully have made an impact for the patients and communities we serve. But I keep a quote from Ginny Rometty, she was the long-term CEO of IBM, on my desk. And it says, I learned to take on things I'd never done before. Growth and comfort do not coexist. And I'm quoting that, but it's true. And a lot of times when I leave to go to work in the morning, I say to my spouse, I say, well, I must be growing because I sure don't feel comfortable, because there are new things that you're taking on, both, as a consequence of the pandemic, or external factors or internal factors. And so it's been a journey, one of both serendipity and planning, and one that I'm grateful for the opportunities and the support I've had along the way.
Yeah, I really appreciate that answer. As we start to, I wouldn't say pivot, but get a little bit more focused in the concept of relationships, do you think, or were you subconscious about curating a network of trusted relationships? And do you feel, kind of looking back and now, they're important to your success, and how, in many ways, has that helped you evolve?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think fundamentally, Steve, relationships are the heart of who we are. They're what brings us joy and gratitude and meaning in many ways in life, whether those are our personal relationships with family and friends, or our professional relationships. And so I think seeking strong relationships is perhaps one of the at least in my humble estimation, one of the defining elements of joy and gratitude in life. And I'm far from perfect in it, and so I'm cautious about about kind of saying that there's a perfect roadmap. But I'll offer a few observations. I think professionally, and particularly in urology, many of our relationships start with our peers, whether that's in medical school or as residents, and building those relationships as lifelong friendships, people who share a common experience that often is one of the more intense experiences of your life. For instance, in training, represents a source of authentic friendships that are important. I think many of us turn to colleagues we train in residency with to be really honest about how we're feeling, and also as source of knowledge and expertise. And I think that's very important. From a professional development perspective, I think early on mentorship relationships are hugely important, right? They create a source of what is possible, seeing how others have developed their career, having someone encourage you, or creating sponsorship, or identifying opportunities for growth. And I've been a beneficiary of incredibly generous mentorship throughout my career. I mentioned Jim Monty and Mark Litwin early in my career here at Michigan. John Berkmeyer is a surgeon who provided mentorship, who encouraged me to think outside of just urology alone. But in each way, there were some key lessons of how to carry yourself, how to build your career, that are really, really essential. And that mentorship builds a sense of strength and self-confidence, and a pathway forward, but also creates an opportunity to pay it forward as an individual, and to establish those mentorship relationships early in your career. So early on, mentorship relationships, and I would say, Steve, throughout your career, having mentors is important. I look for mentors even now, nearly 15, 16 years into my faculty career, who could continue to share their experiences and wisdom. Now, as we advance in our career too, though, peer relationships from a networking perspective also start to become important. And those are not only can they offer friendships, right, but most importantly, they offer opportunities to learn from others whose content expertise and experience might be different from yours. So that might be other colleagues in other clinical disciplines, right? If you're working in an operational setting and you need to learn about how hospital-based services are best deployed, from hospital medicine to radiology to pathology, anesthesiology, emergency medicine, developing relationships with other clinical colleagues who will share their expertise and challenge you on the work being done is important. But I would also say that relationships with non-clinical colleagues, peer relationships, network relationships are very important, particularly as for colleagues who aspire to operational or system level leadership roles. Being open and learning from colleagues in finance and operation and legal and communications and in compliance, there's a certain richness to opening yourself up to those new ideas in those new areas of discipline, and building relationships ultimately is the precursor to trust. And it's with that trust that that you have the opportunity not only to learn the skills in those areas, but also to advance an organization forward. So I would say from early in our career all the way through every stage, relationship building, network development is a source of joy and satisfaction, a source of new information and knowledge and expertise, and probably strengthens organizational performance as a whole.
Yeah. Do you have advice for our listeners on how one should go about building relationships?
Yeah, I think I'd start by saying this. I try to I shamelessly borrow or plagiarize from an architect in my hometown, an architect named Alden Dow, who talked a lot about the virtues of the built environment, this concept of honesty, humility, and enthusiasm. And those are attributes that I try to bring forward, certainly imperfectly, but I try to bring those forward in settings as a leader, as a colleague, or as a friend. And honesty is the baseline, right, Steve? I mean, I think we all go into a relationship with the idea that the individuals we're interacting with are honest with us. And if they're not, that's a real barrier to a relationship in many ways. But I think humility and enthusiasm, and I'll say that adjacent to humility is curiosity. Those are really important aspects of relationship building. I think if you sit down with someone, there can be over the top enthusiasm, but there can also be real and authentic enthusiasm and learning more about what someone else's aspirations are, what their challenges and opportunities are. And inherent to that, right, is that curiosity and humility. Don't bring forward the idea that you have all the answers, that in fact you're involved in that conversation, in that relationship building, to be curious, to learn. And what you'll find, I think, is if you start with that perspective and your first conversations involve more listening or asking questions than actually sharing your own knowledge, that's a real strength in both relationship building, and I would also say in collaborative problem solving. One of my colleagues I work with here at Michigan, Charlie Royland, who's our Chief Operations Integration Officer, he's taught me a lot about this. We often, tough conversations in the professional setting, disagreeing opinions. Charlie often starts those tough conversations by saying something like, teach me about why, right? It's a way to disarm the situation, but it's also a way to express your curiosity, because the notion that you have all the answers is one that in both leadership and relationship building, I think can be a point of tension. And so I would say, think about what your own personal attributes are, but bring to any effort at building relationships honesty, a realistic enthusiasm, and a humility and a curiosity that allows you to learn from others. Those to me might be some attributes that I would suggest support networking, support relationship building. And oftentimes, if at the end of the conversation you did most of the listening, you'll end up learning a lot, and the person who you're with might look forward to the next conversation with you.
Yeah, I love that answer. And I can attest, just thinking about you and having the good fortune of knowing you over the years, I think that sums up you really well, just and who you are, and one of your superpowers, that humble curiosity is impressive to watch, and the way that affects people and engages people. How do you have a specific way that you approach relationships?
Yeah. First, thanks for your kind words, Steve. I appreciate that. And I'm along the lines of the humility, like I think any thoughts I share, are informed by my own experience, and hopefully they're helpful. But I think, first, again, going back to the curiosity, then going back to the intentionality, right? And I'll give you an example. When I started in that chief clinical officer role, like I didn't know a lot about kind of macro finances of a healthcare delivery system. And that was an area where I needed to learn more, right? And your options are, you can go and read a book, you can look at a profit and loss statement and try to figure out yourself, or you can build an intentional network and a relationship. And I was very committed to meeting regularly with our associate chief financial officer to ask questions and to receive feedback and advice around what are the factors that drive revenue? What are the factors that drive expenses? What might be be able to be influenced by management versus really relying on external factors. So one thing is being intentional, right? About pursuing a network and relationships to help continue to build your career and to elevate your knowledge and expertise in a particular area. Second, I think it's important to seek out relationships that I might say kind of from 360 degrees. In other words, colleagues in your organization who are in positions that you report to, or colleagues in your organization who are in different segments of the organization. Get a broad lens on what's happening in your organization. Now, you can't meet everyone in an organization that has 10 or 15,000 people, but you can create relationships in different areas of the organization that help you better understand how the organization functions, gives you empathy for the challenges that others. One of the things that I try to do when we have really hard clinical and operational things is bring together team members from different parts of the organization to share what they're seeing in a particular experience. And that relationship building creates some empathy that often supports problem solving. And I think that's important. And then I think, you want to also create relationships and networks that I think that are diverse, right? Diverse in terms of background, in terms of demographics, in terms of both lived and professional experience. I really believe that diversity of relationships gives you a better lens on how you support engagement in the organization, how you make sure you have opportunities for advancement, and brings greater strength, expertise, and better outcomes for your organization. So we really want to have a 360-degree view of pursuing those relationships. Now, is that easy? No, it takes time and it takes commitment. And so I think you want to be intentional in where you start, and then thoughtful about how you build and maintain those relationships over time.
So I think I'd like to follow up with just one thing that I keep hearing. It appears to me in order to be good at, or perception thereof, or at least from your perspective, in building intentional relationships, there's a fair amount of vulnerability required from you. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I think so. I think, one element of curiosity is vulnerability. And I think you have to be willing to be vulnerable in terms of what your strengths, what your opportunities are. I think that's a foundational element of strong relationships in mind, whether those are leadership relationships, whether those are friendships, whether those are personal relationships. I believe that's an important part of the equation.
So I think additionally, we're talking about how we seek and be intentional about relationships, about networking. How do you make yourself attractive? I think from the other side, for the listener, like, how do you become attractive? I mean, outside of title, what are the behaviors, kind of the attributes that one might want to portray, or at least be authentic to, that would make them a candidate to be networked with, I should say?
Yeah. I'll use a couple descriptors. One, again, curiosity. People like other people who are interested in what they're working on. That's often an important front door. Second is what I'll call generosity, right? Which is the willingness to share. The idea that the success of others, you view that as your own success. So you're willing to share your ideas. You're willing to share your opportunities and challenges. And inherent in that a little bit, Steve, is that vulnerability. So I think curiosity, generosity, and I think follow through is important. And that's true from a mentorship relationship perspective to a peer. Like, if you say you're going to do something, be willing to do it, or be willing to acknowledge that you got so busy that you couldn't follow through on it. Because in the absence of follow through, either on next steps or commitments you said you made, that impacts the trust that ultimately creates the strong networking relationships that help us move forward. So I think, curiosity, generosity, and follow through are among the more important attributes that I think help create those strong relationships and move them forward and sustain them.
When you think about some of your current relationships or your networking, do you have a concept in your mind about how you're going to keep in touch, a cadence to that? Like, like, when you enter the relationship, are you thinking about this temporary versus long-standing, transactional?
Yeah, it's a great question. And this is an area where I'm definitely imperfect. And I guess I'd look at it like, there are going to be some career and lifelong relationships, and let's focus on professional relationships, right? There are going to be some career and lifelong professional relationships that define who you are in your professional world, that when you look back on the influencers of your professional career, it will always be a relatively limited set of individuals. Often they're from earlier in your career. Those are enduring relationships that often it feels like you can pick up the phone once or twice a year, and it feels like you never left. Right. And I think there are a handful of those that don't require more cultivation than that, because the sincerity and the intensity of the relationship early on endures. And I think those are, as I said, often mentorship relations. But I think if you don't reach out at least once or twice a year, you can lose touch on the changes and challenges that your colleagues, your mentors are experiencing. I think for network-based professional relationships, some of that ends up being the circumstances, right? If it's a new relationship to solve or move through a particular project, imagine something like implementing a new technology, and you're working with someone who's in the health information technology, right? There will be the need for new network relationships there that are based on trust and shared knowledge and accountability. When that project ends, it's likely that the frequency of that relationship is going to go close to zero, maybe, unless there's something, and that's okay, right? It's still there. it's like a chapter of a book in your career. You can go back to it. But I think if you feel like every single one of the kind of, I'll say project-based relationships that develop in your career, you're trying to maintain that, it can become a lot, right? To have enough meetings or points of connection to maintain all these relationships. So for these kind of lifelong transformational relationships, I think it's, yearly might be a reasonable, yearly or twice a year might be a reasonable cadence. When you're working on something together, it's usually at least a weekly or twice a month, touch point to make sure that progress is occurring. And then some of those are okay to let them become more opportunistic, right, in the future. And I think that's okay. And I would say that one of the things where I've probably had the biggest gap is making sure that you also maintain your personal relationships, right? As we get busy with work, it can feel like there's so much going on. And how do you spend your discretionary time, right? I mean, that's a question we all have to ask ourselves. How do you spend that discretionary time? And spending some of that discretionary time continuing to build personal relationships, strengthen them, or identify new ones is something I ask myself frequently, like, are you doing enough? Are you doing it well enough? And I think in the end, right, those relationships are ones that will endure across the course of your lifetime, no matter where you are professionally. And I would just encourage all of our listeners, to continue to cultivate and build those. They're the ultimate source of joy and gratitude. And that includes with your family. And we often talk a lot, Steve, right, about work-life balance, professional, personal balance. And I'm far from an expert in that, but I listen and I try to learn from others. And I mentioned Jim Monty earlier. Probably about 10 years ago now, Dr. Monty wrote one of these legends in urology in the Canadian Journal of Urology, and he wrote about his own experience. And I'll paraphrase this incompletely, but the last paragraph was kind of about this concept of work-life balance. And Dr. Monty wrote something along the lines that it's hard to fully separate the two, that your work and your life and your career sometimes feels like a constant calibration and recalibration between those two elements. And if you're thinking you're going to find a perfect balance, it'll be hard. And the other thing is that for your family and friends, for instance, they don't fully separate who you are personally and who you are professionally, right? Those two items are intertwined, and that's okay. And giving yourself a little bit of grace and a little bit of space on that is important.
Yeah, I had one other question around that, and I think you touched on a little bit. And it appears to me that some of your regret has been. I don't want to. Let me paraphrase this: that you have sometimes your personal network has suffered in favor of your professional commitments. Is that a fair statement, or did I misinterpret that?
I think there are always trade-offs, right? The more busy or committed you are in one area, foundationally for me, right, my family is the most important element of my life. And so that discretionary time, spending that with family are choices. And so if your professional time expands to fill more of the space and that discretionary time shrinks a little bit, what can be at risk is some of the personal, I'll say non-family personal relationships that often define who we are and are big sources of joy. And those calibrate and ebb and flow a little bit. Now, I'm fortunate that I have a number of relationships that are in that, what I would call enduring lifelong category. People who, if I called them after not hearing from me for 2 years, wouldn't say, "Where have you been?" They'd say, "How are you doing?" And I think you have to have some of those. But I'll say, like, and I'm sure she's not the only one, but my mom used to tell me when I was young, if you want to have a friend, be a friend. And I think that is that's a lesson that I think as we all calibrate these different levels of responsibility at different points of our career, it's a good one to keep in mind, and one that I certainly have been imperfect around in some circumstances.
Can you give us maybe some examples for the listener? We've talked a lot about building the networks. I mean, you've definitely given some examples, but do you have some thoughts around how you've actually leveraged relationships? Like, hey, I put in the time, I was intentional. Here's how I thought about the structure. We worked through that, but how have you then say, okay, it's time to use the relationships? How do you process that?
Yeah, I mean, I think any relationship, right, needs to be foundationally built on that kind of mutual trust, and that you're not in it simply for a transaction right at the beginning, right? And so I think you have to build strength in a relationship. And my typical approach is to be as generous as I can be early in the relationship, right? To share my knowledge, expertise, with others, knowing that over time there may be an opportunity where I would benefit from that in return. And I think I can think of many different opportunities with that over time, either clinically or in research, or certainly in leadership. And I've used some of the examples before. I talked a little bit about my interactions with a finance leader earlier in my career, right? I intentionally, built that relationship. I shared a lot of knowledge about clinical care delivery. I encouraged my colleagues to round with me to see what's happening in the hospital on the front line. I introduced them to different members of the health system leadership team that they might not have had the other. And then I kind of said, hey, I'm really interested in learning a bit more about would you be willing to spend a little bit more of your time sharing it? So I think that's one example, but I think early generosity builds the ability to kind of, to say, okay, now I'd like to cash in a bit of that social capital that we've built in our relationship for something that's really important to me. I think you want to be generous early, though. It should be the default approach.
Yeah, I love that framing. You've come back to it a couple of times. It really just summed it up really well. The generosity, the trust, right? We work at the speed of trust. You build the trust, and then it's very organic that the opportunities kind of have showed themselves to you in doing that and following that path. Well, David, this has been a wonderful conversation. I can't thank you enough. Do you have any final thoughts for our audience around this topic, or anything you want to leave them with?
I'd say this, Steve, at different moments in different parts of your career, I think we all ask ourselves, are we doing what we love? Are we doing the right thing? Are we ready for the next challenge? And I come back a lot to that quote I mentioned earlier. I think if you get to a point in your career where you're feeling really comfortable where you are, for some colleagues, that's great. And they're going to make an incredible impact. But for other colleagues, that's a moment of when to make a change, right? And how do you know about whether to make a change? Well, one source of strength in that is your network, right? Go out and ask your mentors, ask your colleagues. Another is to think about, a couple things. And I mentioned I grew up in Midland, Michigan, and there was a leader in the town who wrote me this letter when I was in high school. And I always say it came because I was a below average basketball player, but I practiced a lot. And this individual attended one of our games, and he sent me this letter afterwards. And I took it to heart. And I think these were a couple key principles. It said, some of the keys to success in life, if you will, is 1, always use your talents to the best of your ability. And 2, don't be afraid of the risks associated with the mantle of leadership. And so put your opportunities against those things. Is it going to take advantage of your talents? And are you ready for that risk and transition? Because if you are vulnerable, there are risks in these, right? You can make the bad decision, the wrong decision. You can do the wrong thing. I think if you bring humility to the equation, the teams you work with will forgive you those inevitable wrong decisions. But if you make wrong decisions over and over and over again, there has to be accountability in it, right? And so I think when you get ready to make these changes, ask yourself, will it be that new experience, that new mentorship, that new skill set? Do your talents lend you to kind of be able to advance that? Do you accept that there may be some risk there? And finally, do you get joy and gratitude out of elevating others, right? In the end, I think as a leader, when it's about the success of others, it positions you. I think it positions you for a lot of gratitude, a lot more sustainability in a tough role than it's really if it's about what are you perhaps getting out of it. So, not that I do all of that perfectly, but it's a framework that I try to think about and hold myself accountable to. And I would say, Steve Riggs, there are a few better leaders in urology than you are. I've learned a lot from you over the course of my career, watching how you take care of patients, how you support your team members, how you lead in our field. And so among my network, there are a few who I've learned as much from as I have from you. So thanks for having me on today and for the opportunity to share a few thoughts with colleagues in urology.
Yeah, thank you, David. Thank you, Dr. Miller, again, for sharing your time and expertise with us today. And thank you to our audience for joining us on the AUA Leadership and Business Podcast. Until next time, continue to learn, lead, and excel.
Thank you for joining us on the AUA Leadership and Business Podcast. We hope you found today's insights valuable. Remember, growth is a continuous process. To further enhance your business acumen and accelerate your professional development, we invite you to check out the AUA Institute for Leadership and Business track on demand. Featuring 9 courses covering a wide range of leadership and business topics, the ILB track on demand will empower you to lead effectively and achieve your professional goals. Invest in your future and register today at auanet.org/ILB track. That's auanet.org/ILB TRACK. Until next time, continue to learn, lead, and excel.